My name is Emma Claire Lawson. I'm 34 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, in a narrow row house with a plant on the windowsill that I'm almost certain will survive me. By trade, I'm a copywriter for a small non-profit that fights housing insecurity. By habit, I'm a person who catalogs memories like evidence, always filing them away in a way that can be pulled out and examined under harsh light. Right now, emotionally, I'm exhausted and delicate in the way you are after spending too long at an open wound. It's raw, sensitive to any accidental touch, but also insistently alive. I'm trying to tell you all of this because the thing I'm about to confess is tied to every sentence I've ever written, every folded regret, and every word I swallowed. Before I go any further, if you're into real stories that don't flinch from the messy parts of family, please consider subscribing. Sharing this feels like walking into my childhood living room with the front door wide open. Terrifying, but maybe someone needs to hear it. I was adopted at 2 days old. That fact, which should have felt like the beginning of a narrative about luck or salvation, was instead a recurring chorus in my family. "Remember, Emma, you're adopted," my mother would say over breakfast as if she were reading me a weather report. The words were not always cruel. Sometimes they were a shorthand for tenderness, a reminder of why she had waited, adopted, loved. But more often than not, they were the punctuation mark in a sentence that ended with exclusion. I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in a clapboard house with peeling white paint and a wooden porch that caught the humid summer air. The house smelled like lemon oil and the dry paper of the piano music my father kept in a drawer. My father, David, was a man with hands that always smelled faintly of motor oil, even when he'd been working in the office. My mother, Susan, wore floral scarves and kept the house immaculately clean because she believed appearances kept the world manageable. Between them was my older brother, Mark, who was biologically their child. Mark and I were both taught the ritual of the family table. Plates aligned, napkins folded, apologies rationed. When I was little, the reminders felt like lanterns, someone nodding to a hidden map I didn't yet know to read. "You came from different places," they said, "and that makes you special." But those moments were few. More often the reminders were used to explain away my undone homework. "Well, you're not like us. You get that from..." Or to shape the rules applied to me. "We don't let you go out late. We have to be more careful because you're not one of our blood." Those sentences landed with the small, insidious weight of an accusation that what I was could be explained away, excused, or contained. The cadence of our family conversations was an undercurrent of otherness that followed me everywhere. The college counselor who looked surprised when I said I wanted to major in literature. "And your parents, they support you?" My high school boyfriend's mother, who touched my cheek in a way that felt rehearsed and said, "You look like you came from somewhere exotic, don't you?" A teacher who lingered over my adoption paperwork with the same curiosity you might reserve for an old map. I learned to explain myself. I became a small, eager translator. Yes, I was adopted. No, I didn't know my birth parents. Yes, I was grateful. No, it wasn't weird. I rehearsed these answers until they were polished smooth. Explaining became a ritual that kept people's curiosity from turning into a deeper, more dangerous question. "Why are you not like us?" Each explanation was a small concession, a way of keeping the peace, a tiny surrender. There were other things in the house that shaped me. My father's quiet disappointments, the way Major League Baseball scores had a shrine in his heart, the way my mother would wake at 3 a.m. and look at the baby photographs of me, the hospital bracelet crinkled beneath their fingers, as if checking history. On the surface, we were a typical American family. Barbecues on the 4th of July, a neighborly exchange of casseroles, and the kind of fraying holidays that happen when extended family meets and memories are long. But under the surface, everything that wasn't visibly ours, the way my skin tanned a touch differently, the curl of my hair, the way I smiled, became proof to them that I needed reminding, setting straight, steered. One summer when I was 14, standing at our local pool with the scent of chlorine and grilled hot dogs thick in the air, my brother Mark and his friends were laughing and diving off the high board. My mother stood at the edge of the pool in a wide-brimmed hat, watching us. I climbed the ladder, heart banging like a trapped bird, and jumped. When I climbed out and shook the water from my hair, my mother said, loud enough for the water-splattered kids to hear, "Be careful, Em. You know we worry. Not like your brother who's our blood. Laughter. A pause. The sound of skin cooling in the breeze. I remember the hollow in my chest like it was a second rib. I remember days after that, lying on my back on my bedroom floor and staring at a plaster angel on the ceiling, and thinking about how many ways you could be entire and still feel like a guest in your own house. Later, Mark told me she didn't mean it. He told me she was tired. But it wasn't just that one comment. It was a pattern, a phrase here, a gesture there, a parenthetical reminder that I was a different kind of family member. The accumulation of small sharp things. When I was 22, at my college graduation, my parents came up from Cedar Rapids for the ceremony. My father gave me a stapled program he had saved from my high school play, like a small talisman. My mother gave me a framed photograph of my birth certificate, wrapped in tissue paper. For when you want to remember, she said, searching for a way to be kind and controlling at once. The photograph smelled faintly of the lemon oil she used on the dining table. At the reception, when Aunt Lorraine asked if I was going to move back to Iowa and help with the family business, my mother said, loudly and without humor, "I don't know if Emma fits in that life. She has her own history." That night I lay awake in my dorm bed, the air of the city buzzing outside my window, and felt myself deflating into a small, incredulous shape. The world that had shown me adoption as a kind of permanent footnote had made me accountable for explaining it forever. I practiced answers on the ceiling. I was adopted at 2 days old. I love my parents. Yes, I understand my parents had trouble conceiving. No, I don't blame them. I had answers for the strangers, the well-meaning, the nosy, even for the cruel. The problem was that the answers were not for me. They were armor I wore to avoid the worst thing. Asking myself who I would be if I stopped justifying my existence. That idea, the dangerous possibility that I could stop explaining myself, hovered like a door I did not yet have the courage to open. It would take years before I could turn the handle and walk through, and even then I would find the room on the other side was not empty, but full of things with their own histories. Grief, choices, secrets. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people who might need to hear this. I won't make this about numbers, but it is strange how small encouragements feel like lifelines when you're standing alone with a memory. Leaving home felt, at first, like a temporary escape. College was a geography in which my name could exist without the weight of my father's silence or my mother's micro-criticisms. I moved to Chicago for a graduate internship, then to Portland for work, and each move was marketed in my head as autonomy. I learned to say no with a tone that felt clean and final. I learned to compose emails that protected my heart. Yet the reminders from home followed me like a scent. My mother called on Sunday nights, and she would say small things with the soft efficiency of someone who believed that truth was a tool to shape behavior. "We just don't understand some of your choices, Em. You're sensitive, maybe because you're adopted." Mark didn't have to deal with this. The words might have been couched in concern, but they landed as verdicts. My brother Mark was both a fortress and a thorn. He loved me in ways that could be warm and baffling. Sometimes he would dispatch me flowers at odd moments, a sending of love that felt almost embarrassed. Other times, he would repeat a joke our father liked. "You should be grateful they let you into the family." He could be merciful, and he could be cruel. Families are skilled at both. At 28, after a series of bad relationships that had me cataloging my own lack like a list of deficiencies, I decided it was time to look for my birth records. Not because I wanted to desert my parents, I didn't, but because I needed to understand the root of the feeling that some part of me was always on loan. There was an adoption agency in downtown Cedar Rapids that had been the conduit for my adoption. The office smelled of old coffee and dust. There were file cabinets that sang when you opened them. The woman behind the counter, a stout woman with soft eyes named Nancy, slid a file across to me after an hour of paperwork. It had faded typewritten notes and a single black and white photograph of a woman who looked like she had been shading her eyes from sunlight the way I sometimes do. I learned that my birth mother's name was Rosa Mendez. She had been 19, with a rooming house address and an ache of poverty that was heavy on the page. The letter she had written, a single sheet, was full of apologies and hopefulness. "I love her already," she had written. "I am afraid, but I know you will give her the life I cannot. Please tell her I chose this because I thought it was love." There were fingerprints smudged along the bottom, like someone had dried her palms on the paper. The whole thing looked like a small, brave sacrifice. I read the letter until dusk. The agency worker disappeared into a back room and came back with a sealed envelope. "This is an intermediary letter," she said. "We have permission to share. Rosa asked that if and when you wanted contact, you could reach out." I cried in the parking lot because the world had suddenly recalibrated. A woman who I shared blood with had written my name and had not erased me. I felt equal parts joy, fear, and a sense of treachery toward the family who had raised me. I called my mother that night, voice raw, and told her that I had my birth mother's letter. She was silent a long time. "That's good," she said finally. "That's fine." The line went flat. A few weeks later, I found out that my parents had known more than they let on. Unpacked from a conversation with Mark at a bar that smelled of cheap beer and lemon, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard him. They saved her name in a box. "Dad said maybe if you got curious when you were older." The implication hit me like a misread of generosity. They hadn't offered, they'd rationed. It felt like being given a map with critical parts folded into the margins. Seeking Rosa felt like walking toward a lighthouse with a foghorn. I wrote letters with the meticulousness of an archaeologist restoring pottery. I told her about my life, my small injustices, my own attempts to make peace with the past that other people had shaped. She replied after months, and her handwriting was exacting, careful, like someone used to holding a pen steady. "I didn't get to keep you," she wrote, "but I watched a woman near my street and I thought, somehow maybe." She told me about her life, nights washing dishes, the way she sometimes slept on a friend's couch, her slow accumulation of steady jobs that eventually allowed her to move to Des Moines, where she worked in a bakery until a shoulder injury. Meeting her felt like the inversion of everything I'd been told. Rosa smelled faintly of sugar and yeast the first time I hugged her in a park bench during an Iowa January that tasted like metal. She had a laugh that resembled my own, and a scar at her temple that I had never known I carried. She said, without melodrama, "I held you for 2 days when you were born. I thought my knees would give out. Your parents," she added, looking down at her hands, "did what they could. They were scared in their own way. But I wanted you to know you were wanted by someone else too." The revelation changed nothing about the small humiliations my adoptive parents had instilled over the years, but it changed me in microscopic, insistently meaningful ways. Here was a woman who had traded the unbearable difficulty of raising a child in poverty for the uncertain ownership of my life in the form of a letter. She had not abandoned me. She had transferred hope. I began to see the earlier statements, "You're not one of us," in a different light. They were not just about me. They were about fear. Fear of loss, fear of difference, fear of what the world would say about their choices. It didn't solve everything. In fact, it rattled open questions. Why had my parents felt the need to remind me constantly? Had their insistence been a performance for themselves, an attempt to assert control? Had they truly feared I would take something away by simply existing? And what did all of this have to do with the way I loved, the way I failed to trust, the way I waited for permission to belong? The friction between what I had learned and what I had lived with came to a head at my mother's 60th birthday party. They wanted everyone there. Distant cousins, Mark's in-laws, neighbors who had watched me learn to ride a bike. The house on Cedar Rapids Maple Street was immaculately staged, as if my mother had scrubbed any wrinkle of living into a photo of perfection. There were candles, the lemon oil scent I knew by heart, and a cake with 60 and spectacular, piped in sugar. I had flown back for the weekend. Part of me wanted to perform the dutiful daughter. Another part felt like a stranger in a well-known garment. At one point, during toasts, my father, who had been quiet all evening, raised his glass. He spoke about the family, about resilience, about legacy. He paused then, to my astonishment, added, "And Emma, we know she's had a different path. We did what we thought was best, and she became someone we could be proud of, even if she didn't share our blood. There were polite claps. Mark gave me a small, pitying smile. The idea of pride wrapped in that thin, separating clause felt like a bruise. After cake, when the guests thinned and the porch cooled, my mother came to the kitchen where I was rinsing plates. Her voice softened into a place I used to inhabit as a child. "You know we love you, Em," she said, and for a second there was an old tenderness. Then, quietly, hurtfully, "Sometimes I think you seek out your other family to make us feel guilty for adopting you. You make it seem like you're searching for drama." I felt something in me fracture. I had rehearsed my lines of gratitude and understanding 1,000 times, but in that small kitchen, with the lemon scent surround and the hum of the fridge, I realized I was tired of performing. I had spent my entire life making sure no one could accuse me of ingratitude. I had explained myself into a corner, and now there wasn't space to be anything else. I said nothing for a long time. The silence was not empty. It was a field of possibility. Then I tuned my face toward her and, for the first time in my life, I stopped justifying. I did not say, "I'm grateful," or "You're my mother." I said simply, "You hurt me." It was a small sentence, factual and shockingly final. My mother flinched as if struck. Then something like anger uncoiled. "You always do this, Em," she said. "Make everything about you." That night I slept on the living room couch and listened to the slow clock and the small talk of my parents moving through the house. I thought of all the times I'd expected to be defended, to be brought into the warmth without having to burn myself proving my right. Instead, I had learned to reserve myself for explanations. That morning, with a coffee cup and my suitcase, I felt a resolve settle like iced weight in my bones. I would stop explaining. Stopping explaining did not feel grand. It did not come with a trumpet fanfare or sunlight bursting through curtains. It came as a quiet removal of my hand from a constant motion. I stopped answering when people wanted my history told like a parlor trick. I refused to take the bait when someone used adopted like an emotional loophole to excuse bad behavior. At work, when a colleague tried to pry into my family background with something that felt like judgment, I said, "That's private," and left the conversation. At the grocery store, when an older woman reached over and patted my cheek and said, "Adoption is so sad, isn't it?" I no longer offered an account of gratitude. I just smiled, took my cart, and walked away. I was surprised by the small liberation of silence. People who had depended on my explanations were momentarily off kilter, as though the rug of my acquiescence had been pulled. They tested me. "Why won't you tell us?" they asked. "Don't you want people to understand you?" I would answer sometimes with, "I understand myself enough," which was not always true but was honest in its aspiration. Refusing to explain did not protect me from hurt. My mother continued at times to drop jabs, a letter left plain on my doorstep, a comment in a family newsletter, a voicemail that asked why I was so distant. But each time, the sting dulled in a way that felt like muscle building. The more I withheld my explanation, the less they could use it against me. The more I let silence be an answer, the less obliged I felt to perform a history someone else had written for me. The world did not end. Friends and strangers adjusted. Some left. Some stayed. My relationship with Mark became a place of slow negotiation. He would call sometimes, then apologize in the same breath for things he had said, and I would accept his apology in a way that didn't equate to erasing my hurt. I began seeing a therapist who specialized in attachment, and with her help, I mapped the architecture of the ways I expected to be dismissed. I began to name the places in my body where my parents' words had lived for years. A tightness behind my sternum when I tried to speak, a coldness in my hands when someone called me different, an ache in my jaw from all the times I had smiled to keep peace. Through therapy, I realized the most important question wasn't whether others believed me. It was whether I had stopped believing myself. If I could stop explaining, would I begin to inhabit my own skin without apology? The answer, slowly, was yes. But the path to that was tangled with more secrets, and not all of them belonged to me. There was one more reveal waiting in a drawer, a sealed envelope that would change the balance of who had been certified to tell my story. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share. I read every comment, and it helps to know we're not alone. The envelope sat in a shoebox in my mother's closet, the kind of place people hide things they are ashamed of, or things they believe they are protecting. I found it because Mark, in a moment of clumsy honesty over beers one night, had told me there were letters my parents had kept. He said he didn't know why they had saved some and not others. It wasn't meant to be a secret, he said. It was maybe meant to be an emergency thing. When he told me, my throat tightened with a science fiction disbelief. The idea that important parts of my life had been curated for me, like museum artifacts behind glass. The envelope was thick and had my name written on it in a woman's hand I recognized instantly. My birth mother's handwriting from the letter she had sent me years before. Inside there were photographs and a long, folded sheet. It was dated the year I was born. My hands felt suspiciously foreign as I unfolded the page. Rosa had written a confession that read like a seed of explanation. She told my parents the things that often get left out of the sanitized adoption narrative. That she had been using at times, that she had a boyfriend who fled when the consequences loomed, that she had been terrified she would harm a child she could not feed. But more than that, she wrote about a decision that was not only about poverty but about an attempt to give me a life she could not see herself providing. I am not here to judge, she had written to my parents. I only want you to know she is mine in a way that matters even if she is with you. There was another letter, this one in my mother's handwriting, describing how the agency had arranged an open adoption model. Letters exchanged periodically, perhaps a photograph, nothing that would be disruptive. They had, at some point, stopped responding. Later entries in their journal. My parents had kept a journal, had words like relief and possessive fear. The journal showed how my mother's acceptance had been entwined with a nervous reclaiming of marks of belonging. Telling, reminding, labeling. Reading the letters felt like entering a house where people had rehearsed roles. The more I learned, the more I realized the reminders my mother gave me had been an attempt to spell out a family's limits, a way of saying, we made a choice and we will not be undermined by outside truth. In their fear of being accused of taking advantage, my parents had erected a small fortress of constant assertion. Inside that fortress, love and control were blurred so often they had become indistinguishable. Confronting my mother with the letters was one of the hardest things I ever did. I visited on a late autumn afternoon when the trees were half bare and the air tasted of the river. She was sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug, and when I placed the envelope on the table she didn't look surprised. I thought you might find it, she said evenly. I wanted you to have it when you were ready. You could have told me, I said. You could have given me the choice. Her eyes softened and then hardened. We were protecting you, she said. There are things children don't need to know. We were afraid it would complicate your life. Here was the core of the family logic I'd grown up with. Protection as ownership. The conversation slumped into a place that felt like a gentle earthquake. We both made our cases, and neither of us dismantled the other's truth. What I understood in that exchange was that people protect in the way they themselves were protected. With silence, with borders, with reminders that become definitions. Stopping explaining had not been the end. It had been an opening. A few months after the letters resurfaced, I reached out to Rosa and asked to meet again. This time I went alone, on a rainy Tuesday in Portland when the city smelled like wet pavement and coffee. We sat in a small diner that favored vinyl booths. She came with a daughter, my half-sister Anna, who looked like me with her jaw a touch more angular and her laugh less cautious. The three of us spoke for hours over coffee that left damp rings on the table. Rosa had kept my first photo in the heel of her Bible for years, she said, wiping her face when she spoke of it. She had been invested in my life in absent ways, watching for my name in the newspaper, listening for someone to say, Emma, on a television show, tracing the shape of my laugh when she was lonely. The meeting with Rosa and Anna did something complex to the place my adoptive parents occupied in my heart. It did not erase them, and it did not indict them entirely. It layered. My life suddenly had parallel narratives that didn't have to collapse into competition. There was the family that raised me, imperfect and sometimes cruel, and the family that had given me the blueprint of my blood, imperfect in different ways. Holding both truths, I felt my sense of self grow wider. Back in therapy, we talked about the ethics of belonging. Belonging isn't a single contract, my therapist said once. It is negotiated. It can be asserted, and it can be given, and it can be offered. Those words resonated with me because they suggested agency. If belonging only ever had been something people decided for me, perhaps I could decide for myself now. The road to a place where I could own my identity without explaining it to every inquisitor was paved with small acts. It involved boundaries, fewer phone calls that began with a critique, more visits where I decided the agenda. It involved naming my own history out loud to people who mattered. Friends, partners, the small community I had carefully built in Portland. It involved forgiving myself for the ways I'd allowed my narrative to be rehearsed by others. There was one final private shift that marked the end of the old pattern. I was at a family reunion 2 years later, and the room was warm with conversation and the smell of fried chicken. A cousin I barely knew asked, in that tone of polite curiosity people use as a weapon, "So, Emma, what was it like, being adopted? Is that something you still think about?" I felt none of the old prickling need to produce a tidy, grateful speech. I looked at her and said, simply, "Yes, it's part of my life. Not the whole story." I left it at that. No sermon. No defense. No invitation for pity. The response was a slight nod and then a change of subject. The release of breath I felt was physical, like a hand taken off my sternum. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. There's more I want to share, and I don't take the act of telling lightly. People assume that endings are neat. They imagine reconciliations wrapped with bows and revelations that heal like bandages. Real life is messier than fiction, and so my conclusion is both simple and complicated. I stopped explaining myself, and in doing so I learned to accept the multiple truths that made me. The years after I stopped explaining were not a fantasy of perpetual peace. My mother and I had stretches where we did not speak. Other times we navigated small courtesies that felt like fragile bridges. Sometimes she would call and say something that cut. Sometimes she would offer real kindness, her voice soft and unmanipulative. Mark remained somewhere in the middle, alternating between ally and old habit. But my relationships were no longer predicated on my performing gratitude. There was room now for a grief that was not performative. I could be angry at my parents for the ways they had used adoption as a perpetual adjective, and I could still be grateful that they fed me, clothed me, and, in their best moments, loved me. Rosa became a consistent presence in my life. We exchanged more than letters. We exchanged a kind of kinship. She taught me how to frost a cake the way she had learned in the bakery, and I taught her to read poetry she had never considered before. Anna and I, half-sisters by blood, found ourselves building a comradeship that was oddly immediate. We would text about the little inheritances that passed between us. Recipes, jokes, a shared memory of a childhood song that had lodged in our heads. The deeper revolution, though, happened inside me. Stopping the rehearsal of my life for the benefit of others gave me space to build traditions for myself. I stopped answering the question, "Are you adopted?" with a script and started answering it with power, silence, or a small private truth, depending on who asked. I stopped being ashamed. I stopped granting others the carte blanche to define my belonging. There was a moment, 2 years into this new posture, when I realized I could mourn without performance. At a funeral for a neighbor who had been unusually kind to me in Portland, bringing soup when I had the flu, showing up to readings, I stood at the cemetery and felt the old marrow ache. I didn't shape my grief into a story that would invite pity or prove something. I just let it be. And in that letting, I knew I had arrived somewhere. Not at a tidy reconciliation with every person who had shaped me, but at a self that could hold contradiction without cracking. If there's a lesson I would press into your hands like a warm coat, it's this: belonging is not a single certificate someone can stamp for you. Belonging is a risky, daily practice of naming your truths and then refusing to make your life an exhibit for someone else's anxieties. People will continue to give you reasons to explain yourself. They will expect performances of gratitude and narratives shaped to comfort them. But you get to decide what to offer. My final conversation with my mother was ordinary, and ordinary is, to me, the most honest place to live. She called one early spring and said, "I found a photograph of you at the park when you were 3. You had a red coat and a candy stick." I could hear the edge of years in her voice. I said, "I remember that coat." We spoke for a long time about small things. Weather, a shared recipe that needed salt, Mark's new job. There was no extraordinary reconciliation, no big reveal. But there was distance that had been navigated, and a recognition that both of us would have to live with the ways we had loved and hurt one another. On my wall now, above my desk, there are 2 photographs side by side. One is of my adoptive parents at my high school graduation, smiles a little brittle. The other is of Rosa and Anna and me at the Portland Art Museum, frozen mid-laugh. They are not symmetrical, and they do not cancel each other out. They hang together because neither story is the whole story. Together they form something that feels like a true map of me. If you are listening and you feel the old weight of explanation in your throat, I want to tell you gently. You do not owe the world your backstory as proof of your right to exist. You can stop explaining. You can choose who gets to hold the narrative. And when you stop, you might find people you didn't expect, new forms of love, and the quiet dignity of owning your own life. Has something like this ever happened to you? Share in the comments. I read every one. If this story helped or moved you, a like helps others find it. And if you want to hear more confessions, more odd, true tales, please subscribe. Telling this story was an act of courage, and your listening matters. I don't have a Hollywood ending. I have instead a life that is my own, messy and tender, stitched from different people's choices and my own decisions. The adoption that once defined me is now one strand among many in a story I choose to keep telling on my terms. If that's not a small kind of victory, I don't know what is.